It's Thursday, October 6th. Let me show you one of my favorite patches in the garden right now. I can see mung bean, turnips, Chinese cabbage, kale, peas, and rye. That's this grass that's coming up here. A lot of fun to just see what unfolds, see the kind of genetic variation that can come in kale, for example. You got ones that do almost kind of look like gloves, lots of little finger-shaped things. And you've got other ones that have kind of broad leaves. I highly recommend growing a grex or a landrace. Preferably a grex, honestly, because it's like, well, okay, so you think that you have some experience growing, plant X, whatever that might be. Let's say kale. But you can really, if you really want to see sort of the full spectrum of what kale can look like, or something close to a spectrum, put it that way. A spectrum that you can observe, grow out. I think that will help us as growers to be sort of more imaginative in what we can grow, as well as just to understand sort of the nature of the plant a little bit better. So it being fall, it's the temperatures have been getting down in the 40s Fahrenheit here. I know the metric system is better. There's no question. I think the best example of why the metric system is better is how much does a liter of water weigh? 1 kilogram, right? So 1 gram or 1 gram of water is 1 milliliter. Anyway, yeah, it's obviously better. The point I was trying to make was that, yes, it's been getting pretty cold, and you can see a lot of stuff starting to die off, and new things kind of popping up. One thing that does seem to be having a good run right now is these sort of smaller mochadas. And on the Landrace message board that's associated with the course that I'm now signed up for, that allows me to be in the seed swap, the Landrace seed swap that they're doing, which I'm real excited about. That's going to be very cool. Sort of like, gotta get my. It's like, sending a representative to the Olympics. Except what we're actually doing is just, hopefully having, one of the most diverse sets of genetics we possibly can out there, which is what you want in order to be able to sort of tune your system. I want to draw a little bit of attention to some potatoes that have kind of come back up. So that's an interesting trait. For me, potatoes is something I plant in the spring, and then they kind of die off by about July or June. And so interesting to see these back. They may make a little bit of a resurgence. I won't be taking any out, I don't think, but it's good to have stuff coming out of the ground still. Here's it's tricky. Yeah, potato and tomato leaf, you will notice they do look a lot alike. But that's potato leaf, that's a tomato leaf. Growing out TPS, true potato seed, you do get a sort of broader sense of what a potato can look like as a plant. So I recommend, yeah, spending a little time dipping into sort of the genetic diversity of whatever it is that you're growing. One thing I wanted to bring up was that when you Google the word landrace, you may notice this if you guys are landrace vegetable gardeners. One of the most popular things that comes up is cannabis, marijuana. And so landrace cannabis, why is this the number one hit? Well, first off, you have to understand the sort of fervor around the breeding of cannabis. In this country, America, to its credit, despite it being basically technically illegal, there are some pretty cool things going on with cannabis breeding across the world. But so land races, this is such a popular and hot term because it seems as though the sort of high grade stuff that gets you high in marijuana is kind of at a genetic bottleneck, and that they are in need of sort of older versions of the plant. And so that you can find these videos of guys, Dutch guys, or again Amsterdam. The cannabis scene is pretty big there, and they go out and they're looking in the jungles of drug-torn Colombia, Acapulco Gold, all the places where like there used to be in sort of the history, it was like before there was this sort of domestic marijuana revolution in the United States. Most of it was imported, right? We didn't really know how to grow it here yet. And so they would have names associated with the places that they came from, but that everything was basically a land race. And so there had been, local genetics that were still diverse, but kind of locked down in terms of the desirable traits growing in these places. And that because they were growing with kind of, terroir being as strong as it was, with culture and selection over the years in these places, it can even sort of grow out on its own in some places, sort of semi-wild. And so that is why they seem to be so interested in land races as sort of a source of genetic material. And as with anything else, when you run into a genetic bottleneck, you need to roll back the clock, right? And with a domesticated plant, right? And domesticated, cannabis sativa is, it's domesticated. This is not a wild plant. But you do see, wild hemp, wild cannabis on the side of the road sometimes. This is, hempy hemp. Don't think it'll get you high or get you very high. And I would recommend, though, if you're sort of interested in sort of, their breeding. I don't know of too many people that are doing population breeding among cannabis. It does seem to be mostly line breeding. And yes, someone should jump in there and start doing that, while this, sort of new way of thinking is taken off. And there probably have been, and this is something that naturally happens in, these sort of hotspots of domestication. You save seeds, and even just kind of by accident along the way, interesting things happen. You start sort of nudging the genetics in one direction or another. So, what I was going to say is I would recommend listening to an interview with this cannabis breeder named Bodhi. And I heard him on the Podcast is the name. There's an Australian fella that runs it, and he's all about cannabis breeding. This guy Bodie, he said that cannabis is nature's Wi-Fi, and I mean he's you can tell by his name probably that he's kind of a spiritual guy. He is considered to be sort of the breeder among breeders, people, cannabis breeders, and there are many. He is viewed as kind of an iconoclast. He's traveled the world extensively looking for new cannabis genetics. And he has an interesting policy. He does not trade seeds. He doesn't give people sort of, Western or sort of non-landrace genetics. He does, but he's asking them for seeds. So he brings vegetable seeds that he thinks might be useful to the people in these really remote villages, and some far off parts of the world. And but he seems pretty adamant about keeping landraces in the areas where they have been sort of historically grown. So maybe I'll put a link for it or find it out there somewhere. It's very long. I think it's like 3 hours. They like to go long on these cannabis podcasts, it seems. But whatever, it's a plant. Whatever your stance is on marijuana, it's a plant. I would love to be able to grow hemp without a license. I think a plant's a plant, and there should be full freedom to do whatever you want, and no plant should be illegal. No plant, I think, should be sort of regulated. But yeah, it would be really cool to grow a hemp landrace. Hemp seed, if you've ever tried it, is very delicious. I would like to make some hemp seed miso, for example. And yeah, so maybe down the line, a couple years, I can get some landrace hemp growing. And hemp's great because it's got famous for creating lots of biomass, or growing quickly, sequestering a lot of carbon. So anyway, I wanted to touch on what's going on in the world. If you Google the word landrace, I feel like this needs to be talked about. But if you're looking for an example of how much breeding and selection can do, consider that cannabis has gotten stronger in the, just in the last 30 years, and continues to, keep getting stronger. I think, you hit a point in which there's only so much of a chemical that can be sort of taken from a plant and from nature. But, what that limit is, I don't know. I think that we may be able to really open things up with landrace cannabis as well, in its many uses. And I think that's something we need to remember here, is that it's like to make a plant illegal, especially one with so many other sort of ancillary side uses like that, I think is very, very stupid. But governments are going to do what governments are going to do. But yeah, get with me. I'd be interested to see if you know of anybody doing hemp as a landrace. That would be interesting. Seems like it outcrosses pretty easily. I was talking to a buddy of a buddy, I would say, but a friend of mine. We were out at his kind of country house, and his friend was there, and he was talking about how basically his whole life he's been growing marijuana, kind of just out in the isolated areas. You just kind of pick a spot and put some plants down. And anyway, yeah, so it was very interesting to hear from him what sort of the culture of that is around here. This is kind of, associated with in the Kentucky area. Many people who used to be moonshiners moved on to growing marijuana once, a good kind of outdoor domestic version worked. I watched a really interesting, partly interesting. There was a show called Murder Mountain, which is about the cannabis growing scene in the Emerald Triangle in California. Anyway, for about 10 minutes during the series, it's very sensationalized kind of true crime bullshit, which I think is not my thing. So most of it was not good, but they did this really cool. There's about 10 minutes of it where they go through sort of the history of cannabis growing in Mendocino County, or the Emerald Triangle. And there was a really interesting story about how this guy, I can't remember his name, but people were interested in having weed and in growing it. But most of what people were smoking in the United States came from that point. Mexico, or was imported from these other places, Vietnam, etc. And so there were these hippies, trying to live off the land up in, the hills of Northern California, and they were trying to grow Mexican stuff, and the seeds, I guess weed had a lot of seeds in it back then, and so he found a bunch of seeds and grew some Mexican stuff. And it never really worked out because it's a very, very different climate. But then they heard that there was these, there were these people growing cannabis in, I think it was Afghanistan, up in the mountains. This is high altitude, kind of more trickier to grow stuff and areas. And so there's a guy went over to try and get seeds, and he found a bunch, and they hid it. There's some great story about hiding it in a doll or something. I can't remember what it was, but he came back with that and then grew that out next to the Mexican stuff. So we had Himalayan, the Mexican. So these are basically, a cross of two land races. And that was, I don't know, I think maybe they claimed that it was like the world's first hybrid marijuana. But I don't know if that's actually true. But it was sort of a breakthrough in being able to grow these things. They sort of cracked open the genetic code, and within a pretty short amount of time, we're really getting to grow well in that area. Which in the show Murder Mountain, a police officer says there's nothing really that great about the climate here, other than it is remote. So there's nothing actually special about the climate. And this is a cop, so what does he know? But point being, yeah, it wasn't necessarily the best place to grow it, but they figured out a way. They sort of walked through some genetics, rolled things back, rolled the dice, and within pretty short order had plants that were world renowned. So interesting to think about. what are some of those sort of rare genetics that you might import into your landrace? How far, how much, what do you expect a melon to look like? What can you accept a melon looking like, as long as it tastes great, or does for you whatever it is you want the plant to do for you? So, been thinking a lot about that lately. The course, yeah, it's really cool to just sort of, I've kind of thought through this, sort of theoretical basis of how this approach to seed saving and growing works. And I gotta say, it's just really fun to think about. It's sort of a framework you can use to apply to other things in life, I think. But that you are sort of, in the driver's seat. You're sort of taking what's maybe noise, at the very beginning you have sort of, a noisy set of genetics. But it's a diverse set of genetics. You have lots of different versions of what a plant can look like. And then you tune in, you sort of, by selecting for one thing over another, you tune in the genetics. Nature is also going to do a lot of selection for you. Some things simply won't live. And I think it's really reassuring to know that, right? When something doesn't work out, it's not that I'm a bad gardener. It's just that, this is, a quote from Joesph Lofthouse, Landrace gardening course. He's not blaming himself. That's just, this genetics didn't work out. This one did. Be happy about the ones that did work out. When you get a watermelon with literally one seed, which I have going right now. Tiny watermelon about that big. I'm like, whoa, this is magic. It's not magic. It's science, but I think the way that we get to interact with it is kind of magical, because you are sort of controlling the expression of a set of algorithms. If you want to think of DNA as sort of an algorithm, sort of a possible way that you can exist on planet Earth. And we also, we see that because DNA does use sort of discrete units, there's some sort of hint there to me, that means that, like humans using discrete units of language, that there is some sort of, creativity, there is some sort of meta-awareness, it seems, about what these things are doing. And another thing I wanted to bring up, I recently got a book called I think it's called the Regenerative Gardener's Guide to Soil Amendments, or something like that. This was tipped off to me by someone online. I was on some Reddit forum, and it was sort of related to Korean natural farming, and this guy was like, this guy seems to have written sort of, he's taken Master Cho's or Han Kyu Cho, although in the book he claims that it's not Han Kyu, that it's someone else, not Youngsang, his son, who did Jadon, who developed these methods. So I may have been saying the name wrong of the guy who invented or sort of popularized Korean natural farming. Again, this is something that also is quite popular in the cannabis community, ANF and Jadon. If you go to forums, you'll see most people, it's like, how do my plants look? And there is a marijuana plant. So, why not though? It's all just plants. And, marijuana growers, they are very dedicated people, right? And they may be using nature's Wi-Fi, as Bodhi claims, right? So, oh, anyway, the book The Regenerative Gardener's Guide to Soil Amendments. And I think that's the name of the title. It's basically him sort of doing the KNF recipes. IMO, he goes through IMO 1 through 4. He does the eggshells and vinegar, water soluble calcium, all those in, I think, what is a more sort of readable format. With KNF, there's like these PDFs that people throw around, and it's like there's, a bunch of different versions of them. One that seems to, be specific to India is, but it's like, what is the real way you're supposed to do it? It's sort of how the human mind goes with that kind of stuff. What is this? I want the official version. Whether or not, whatever. Anyway, this guy, I think, has done a really cool thing with it, because he does seem to be sort of agnostic about it as a kind of doctrine, as something you're doing or not doing, but says, look, this is scientifically what's going on here. This is how it works, and this is free and easy to make. And anyway, so it's a pretty cool book. He says some really interesting things about water, which I kind of wanted to touch on a little bit. Let's talk about water. And here's where things get. You go online and it's like, I think I may be veering into the realm of pseudoscience. When people are like charging their water in these vortexes and stuff like that. When I see that, I'm kind of like, I don't know. I think this is where this doesn't seem particularly elegant to me as a system. I would like it to be a little simpler, whatever this is. But you see these guys swirling around, water. And in this book, he has a bucket with magnets on it that he says can allow you to use your water as a foliar spray without using any surfactant, which is sort of something that makes water, the surface tension of water, less, and so then it will then relax and not bubble up, but sort of coat the leaf. So if you're trying to put a foliar on this, you've got to coat the leaf. You don't want lots of little bubbles. You don't want lots of little. And your water hardness, I think, affects that as well. Reverse osmosis water as opposed to other kinds of water. In this book, he uses the term good water, which I think is interesting. So this is not necessarily your tap water. Good water, rainwater, good water. Have you seen these things saying that rainwater is now undrinkable? I don't know if I believe that. Anyway, but I think he mentions this, that water seems to sort of, on some level, maybe defy the conventional laws of physics. And let me get my head straight here before I go on. In that, a snowflake, for example, you can control for, some people, it used to be like, oh, well, snowflakes, there was like a piece of dust on there that would then set it off in whatever particular motion it was going. But I think controlling for all that, even, there does seem to be some kind of X factor, some sort of, you could say, creativity to the water molecule. No two snowflakes are alike. The water does exhibit some kind of mysterious, perhaps conscious properties. And that, you can't have DNA. DNA can't evolve without water. Water may have, in its infinite complexity, created the sort of storm, the conditions, the perfect storm that can cause DNA to start self-replicating, things like that. So yeah, the mysterious properties of water. I'm all for it. I think that there should be some kind of mystery in all this. But we can also, say certain things, abstract things with a pretty high degree of certainty. We can say that, tall plants are likely to have tall children. And we don't need to know why. Tallness is not something that it seems as though, a plant itself would be aware of. I don't know, but that it's not a trait that's entirely genetic. There's not going to be any sort of chunk of DNA we can pull out and say this is tallness, right? Because it is not a yes or no sort of attribute. It is a more or less kind of thing. And I think it's important that we recognize that what we're doing, things like tasting, right, fruits before you save them, is a sort of qualitative, not quantitative measure. It is more or less, right? But there's not really, any way. And again, other than the human experience and what it invokes in you, in your mouth, or how it makes you feel. Does it feel nutritious? Does it sit well in your stomach? Those are really hard things to quantify. But you can do this quite intuitively and have really good results. But the nutrient density, this is something that also came up in the Landrace gardening course, is kind of all over the place and doesn't seem to correspond with conventional versus organic. But genetics actually matter more than a lot of other things. And that for your particular growing conditions, whatever those might be, you are going to have to just tune it in. This is calibrated genetics, as I said in the previous video. And yeah, simply sort of changing your mindset about how you approach genetics. There's lots of great things that you can take from what we know scientific level. But I hope you have been encouraged by the fact that our most reliable food plants on Earth were created by people who had, by our standards, a pretty limited understanding of genetics. Granted, they could observe things that could lead them to similar conclusions. So at the end of the day, it's like, whatever gets you to the right the thing you want is fine. And yeah, I think we're maybe being a little bit kind of unadventurous when it comes to our breeding of food plants in the past, or sort of this Western industrial version of this, but that we should really keep open minds about what any sort of version of a plant can look and taste like. But that if something grows well, right, and it may taste terrible but grow well, then you can say, well, let's plant it. Let's cross grows well with tastes great as populations, and then you'll eventually get what you're looking for, right? The best of lots of different worlds. We are sort of out of thin air, kind of making this happen over time. Evoking attributes that the plant itself is not aware of. Exploiting, making one thing bigger, other things smaller. And so we really are in nature's playground when we are exploring genetic diversity in food plants. And then that opens your eyes to the idea that, well, anything could be a food plant. Another thing that I've been thinking about lately is the domestication of koji. So koji is the domesticated mold used in Asian cooking. China, Japan, and Korea primarily. Other countries as well, though. But this is something that breaks down starches into sugars, proteins into amino acids, etc. A tool, but yeah, for use by humans for a long time. Before, before any conventional knowledge of breeding and genetics and all this work, but that somehow people were able to separate out non-toxic versions of this stuff, that basically grows in your soil. Right? There's something kind of similar to koji in your soil, probably. Floats around. Aspergillus oryzae, and sort of everything in the kind of the Aspergillus world, it seems is actually pretty ubiquitous. But you get, an all-white mold, something any KNFer would be proud of, and suddenly you have this enzyme that you can use at your disposal to break down food and make it more nutritionally available. How did they do that? Perhaps with something kind of like a landrace. Probably said, well, we get how this game goes with plants. Let's try it with some mold, some filamentous fungus, shall we? And here we have a useful thing. So I'm going to be making a landrace koji. I have I think maybe 4 or 5 different koji spores. Some are more attuned to starch, breaking down starches. Some are more attuned to breaking down proteins and amino acids. So different ones for different sort of purposes. But I'm going to say